The morning sun peeked through the windows of the small-town Denny's restaurant, casting warm patches of light across the freshly wiped tables. Steam rose from the coffee maker behind the counter, filling the air with that familiar morning aroma that had become such a part of Diana's life. She'd been working here for 6 years now, and the restaurant felt more like a second home than just a workplace. Diana adjusted her name tag and tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear as she refilled the sugar dispensers. It was just past 10 a.m., that peaceful lull between the breakfast rush and lunch crowd when things started to quiet down. The regulars had mostly cleared out, leaving behind half-empty coffee cups and newspapers folded to the crossword puzzles. "Hey, can you handle table 7? I need to take my break," her coworker Jenny called out, already untying her apron. Diana gave her a thumbs up, grateful for the easy pace of the morning. She loved these quieter moments when she could really connect with her customers, learn their stories, and make their days a little brighter with a friendly smile or a perfectly timed coffee refill. The familiar chime of the entrance bell caught her attention. Through the door came a well-dressed couple, the kind you might see in real estate advertisements. The woman wore an expensive-looking blazer and heels that clicked against the tile floor. The man carried himself with an air of authority, his hand firmly gripping the shoulder of a young boy who walked between them. Something about the boy made Diana's motherly instinct stir. While the couple radiated confidence, the child seemed to fold in on himself, making his body as small as possible. He was dressed well enough in clean jeans and a collared shirt, but his shoulders hunched forward in a way that didn't match his nice clothes. "Welcome to Denny's," Diana called out warmly, grabbing 3 menus from the host station. "Please, sit wherever you'd like." She watched as they chose a booth near the window, the adults sliding in on one side while the boy sat alone on the other. As Diana approached their table, she couldn't help but notice more details. The couple's wedding rings matched, catching the sunlight, but something felt off about their interaction with the boy. Most parents she served would naturally include their child in the conversation, ask what they wanted to drink, or at least acknowledge them in some way. These two spoke over him as if he wasn't there. "I'll have a coffee. Black," the man stated before Diana could even finish her greeting. His voice carried that tone of someone used to giving orders. "Make that 2, the woman added, not looking up from her phone. "And just water for him." She gestured vaguely toward the boy. Diana's eyes met the child's for just a moment as she wrote down the drink orders. In that brief glance, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A flicker of fear, quickly hidden as he dropped his gaze back to the table. Years of serving customers had taught Diana to read people, and everything about this scene felt wrong. "I'll be right back with those drinks," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease growing in her stomach. As she walked away, she could hear the man speaking to the boy in low, stern tones. Working in a restaurant, you learn to trust your gut. Diana had seen all sorts of families come through those doors. Happy ones, tired ones, families having bad days, and families celebrating good news. But this was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. But as she gathered their drinks, she decided to keep a close eye on table 7. Sometimes, she knew, the most important things were the ones left unsaid. Diana balanced the drinks carefully on her tray, her mind still buzzing with concerns as she walked back to the table. She'd learned over the years that there's a big difference between helicopter parents and whatever was happening here. The man's grip on his menu was too tight, his knuckles almost white, while the woman kept scanning the restaurant as if checking all the exits. "Here we go," Diana said cheerfully, setting down their coffees. "Are we ready to order, or do you need another minute?" She made sure to look directly at the boy, trying to give him a chance to speak. But before he could open his mouth, the man cut in. "He'll have the kids' pancakes," he said sharply. "Plain. No stirro." The boy's shoulders seemed to sink even lower, if that was possible. Diana noticed he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm spring weather. something that wouldn't have seemed odd on its own, but added to everything else. As she wrote down their orders, the boy shifted in his seat, and that's when she saw it. The collar of his shirt slipped just a bit, revealing what looked like fresh bruises on his neck. The kind that doesn't come from playing too rough at recess. Her pen paused mid-word, but she forced herself to keep writing as if she hadn't noticed anything unusual. The woman must have seen Diana's slight hesitation. "He fell off his bike," she said quickly, reaching across the table to adjust the boy's collar. "He's so clumsy sometimes, aren't you, sweetie?" The term of endearment sounded hollow, rehearsed. The boy nodded mechanically, but didn't look up. Diana had seen plenty of kids with bike injuries during her years of serving families. They usually couldn't wait to tell the story, proudly showing off their battle scars. This boy's silence spoke volumes. Even the way he held himself, like he was trying to disappear into the booth, set off every alarm bell in her head. "The food will be right out," Diana said, keeping her voice steady. As she turned to leave, she deliberately dropped her pen near the boy's side of the booth. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, bending down to retrieve it. At that moment, she got a closer look at his hands gripping the edge of the seat. His knuckles were scraped raw, and there were marks around his wrists that looked suspiciously like rope burns. Back at the server station, Diana's hands trembled slightly as she put in their order. Jenny noticed her distraction. "You okay?" she whispered. Diana nodded, not wanting to draw attention, but her mind was racing through everything she'd seen. The couple's expensive clothes and confident manner would normally make them look like any other well-off family, but something was deeply wrong. The boy hadn't spoken a single word. He hadn't even looked at the menu before the man ordered for him. And those marks. Diana had done the mandatory trafficking awareness training last month, and every red flag they talked about was right there at table 7. She watched from behind the counter as the man checked his phone repeatedly, his leg bouncing under the table with nervous energy. The woman kept touching her purse, which sat ready at the edge of the booth. They had the look of people preparing to leave quickly if they needed to. Diana's heart was pounding now. She'd seen parents in a hurry before. People rushing to get to church or sports practice or doctor's appointments. This felt different. This felt like people who were ready to run. And that boy looked like he'd given up, hoping anyone would notice him at all. As she gathered their water refills, Diana couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't do something, right now, she might never see that boy again. Sometimes being helpful means more than just keeping coffee cups full. Sometimes it means being brave enough to trust your instincts, even when you're scared of being wrong. And right now, every instinct Diana had was screaming that this child needed help. Diana approached the table again with fresh water glasses, her mind still wrestling with what to do. That's when something happened that changed everything. The boy's fork slipped from his hand, making a soft clinking sound as it hit the floor. A simple accident. Except it wasn't an accident at all. "I'll get that," Diana said quickly, but the boy was already bending down to pick it up. As he reached under the table, he turned his face toward her, and for the first time, their eyes truly met. In that brief moment, his hand formed a clear signal, palm forward, thumb tucked in, fingers folded down. The same signal they'd learned about in that training session last month. Diana's heart nearly stopped. The signal had been all over social media lately, a silent cry for help that even kids were learning about. There was no mistaking it. The boy's eyes held a desperate plea, and his hand trembled slightly as he made the sign, careful to keep it hidden from the couple. "Here, let me get you a clean fork," Diana said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her body. She noticed how the man's jaw clenched at the boy's movement, and how the woman's hand shot out to grip the child's arm as he sat back up. Walking back to the kitchen, Diana felt like she was moving through a dream. All those little things she'd noticed suddenly came together like puzzle pieces forming a horrifying picture. The protective training she thought would never be needed was now playing on repeat in her mind. She pushed through the kitchen doors, her hands shaking as she grabbed a clean fork from the silverware station. Through the small window in the door, she could see the boy sitting perfectly still, his food untouched. The woman was whispering something to him, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Jenny," Diana whispered to her coworker who was plating pancakes nearby. "I need you to do something for me, but act normal." Jenny must have heard something in her voice because she didn't ask questions, just nodded while continuing to arrange bacon on a plate. "When I go back out there, I want you to walk past that table near the window, the couple with the young boy. Look at him carefully, but don't be obvious about it. I need to know I'm not crazy." Diana's voice was barely above a whisper now. Jenny gave her a questioning look but agreed. They'd worked together long enough to trust each other's instincts. Diana returned to the table first, placing the clean fork down with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Is everything tasting all right?" she asked, noting how the boys' pancakes remained untouched while the adults had nearly finished their meals. The man grunted a response, but Diana was watching Jenny from the corner of her eye as she walked past the table, pretending to wipe down nearby surfaces. When their eyes met again at the server station, Jenny's face had lost some of its color. "Did you see it too?" Diana asked quietly. Jenny nodded, her usual cheerful expression replaced with concern. "The marks on his neck," Jenny whispered. "And did you notice how he flinched when that woman reached across the table?" She paused, then added, "What do we do?" Diana took a deep breath. She'd been asking herself that same question for the past 20 minutes. But now, seeing that deliberate signal, the one they'd specifically been trained to recognize, she knew there was only one right answer. This wasn't about being nosy or overstepping bounds anymore. This was about potentially saving a child's life. "Cover my tables for a few minutes," Diana said, her decision made. "I need to make a phone call." She glanced back at the table one more time. The boy was staring down at his cold pancakes, but she could see his hands gripping the edge of his seat, his knuckles white with tension. He'd been brave enough to ask for help. Now it was her turn to be brave enough to answer. Diana's hands trembled as she pushed open the door to the employee break room. The small space felt unusually quiet compared to the gentle clatter of dishes and murmur of conversations in the dining area. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, then stopped, doubts suddenly flooding her mind. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a family having a bad day? The consequences of making such a serious accusation weighed heavily on her shoulders. She thought about her own childhood, about how sometimes parents and kids just don't get along. But then the image of that boy's deliberate hand signal flashed through her mind again, and her doubt began to fade. Through the break room's small window, she could see the couple's table. The woman was checking her watch repeatedly now, while the man drummed his fingers on the table with increasing impatience. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't eaten a single bite of his food. He sat there like a statue, afraid to even breathe too deeply. Diana remembered a story from last year's training session. A gas station clerk had noticed something off about a young girl and her companion. The clerk had the same doubts, the same fear of being wrong. But she made the call anyway, and it turned out that girl had been missing for 3 months. That clerk's decision to trust her instincts had reunited a family. Better to be wrong and embarrassed than right, and do nothing, Diana whispered to herself, remembering her trainer's words. She unlocked her phone and dialed 911, her heart pounding so loud she worried they might hear it through the walls. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice helped steady her nerves. "I'm calling from the Denny's restaurant on Oak Street," Diana said quietly, cupping her hand around the phone. "I'm a waitress here, and I think we have a situation with a trafficked child." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, like something from a crime show rather than her ordinary morning shift. The dispatcher's voice remained steady, professional. "Can you tell me what you've observed?" Diana took a deep breath and started listing everything. The boy's silence, the bruises, The rope marks on his wrists, the controlling behavior of the adults, and most importantly, the deliberate distress signal he'd made. The boy looks around 10 or 11, she continued. Brown hair, blue t-shirt under a gray long-sleeve shirt. The couple with him. They're well-dressed, but something's off. The woman keeps watching the door, and the man. He's got this way of talking, like he's daring anyone to question him. Through the window, Diana saw Jenny approaching the table with more coffee, buying them time. The dispatcher was asking more questions, typing quickly in the background. Are they showing any signs of wanting to leave? Yes, Diana replied, her stomach tightening. It barely touched their food, and they keep checking the time. I'm worried they'll try to leave before help arrives. Okay, listen carefully, the dispatcher said. We have officers already in the area. They'll be there in less than 5 minutes. Can you keep them there without raising suspicion? Diana watched as the man raised his hand, clearly getting ready to ask for the check. I'll try, she promised. Please hurry. Ending the call, Diana leaned against the wall for a moment, taking deep breaths. She'd done it. She'd made the call. Now came the hard part, acting normal while keeping them there long enough for help to arrive. She grabbed some fresh coffee and headed back out, her legs feeling like jelly. Jenny gave her a subtle nod as they passed each other. Years of friendship meant they could read each other without words. Jenny would help however she could. Diana forced herself to smile as she approached the table again. More coffee, she asked brightly, even as her eyes caught the boy's slight tremor when the man shifted in his seat. And how about some fresh pancakes? Those ones must be cold by now. She had to keep them there, just for a few more minutes. Just long enough for help to arrive. The man opened his mouth, probably to decline, but Diana was already reaching for the untouched plate. It'll just take a minute, she said cheerfully, not giving them a chance to object. We want everyone to enjoy their meal. Her cheerful waitress smile stayed firmly in place, even as she silently prayed for the police to hurry. The next 15 minutes felt like the longest of Diana's life. Every time the door chimed, she looked up hoping to see police officers, only to find another regular customer walking in. The breakfast rush had died down, leaving the restaurant quieter than usual, which only added to her anxiety. In the kitchen, she tried to take as long as possible with the fresh pancakes. Her hands shook slightly as she carefully arranged fresh strawberries on top, something she hadn't done with the first order. Anything to buy more time. Through the kitchen window, she could see the man checking his phone again, his face growing darker with impatience. The cops are coming, Jenny whispered as she passed by with dirty dishes. Diana gave a tiny nod, not daring to say more. The weight of what was happening pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe normally. Order up, called the cook, sliding the fresh plate of pancakes across the counter. Diana's heart jumped. She'd run out of reasons to stall. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the plate and headed back to the table, walking as slowly as she dared without being obvious about it. Here we go, she said brightly, setting down the steaming pancakes. I added some fresh fruit on the house. Hope that's okay. The woman's lips tightened into a thin line at the unexpected addition, while the man's hand clenched around his coffee cup. The boy's eyes whitened slightly at the sight of the strawberries, and for just a moment, Diana saw a flash of what he might look like under normal circumstances. Just a kid excited about something sweet. Then the man cleared his throat sharply, and that glimpse of childhood vanished. We didn't ask for extras, the man said coldly, reaching for his wallet. Just bring us the check. The woman was already gathering her purse, her movements sharp and agitated. Diana's stomach dropped. They were getting ready to leave, and still no sign of the police. She had to think fast. Oh, I'm so sorry about the system, she said, forcing a laugh. It's running really slow today. Might take a few minutes to get your check printed. The man's face darkened. We'll pay cash, he snapped, pulling out a handful of bills. The woman was already standing, her hand reaching for the boy's arm. Just then, Jenny appeared at the table, accidentally on purpose bumping into the woman's purse and sending its contents scattering across the floor. "Oh my goodness, I'm so clumsy," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees to help gather everything up. "Let me help you with that." Diana could have hugged her friend for the quick thinking. As the woman reluctantly knelt to collect her belongings, Diana saw movement near the entrance. Two men in casual clothes walked in, looking for all the world like ordinary customers. But the way they scanned the room told a different story. Behind them, she glimpsed police cars pulling up outside, lights off to avoid drawing attention. Her heart began to race. Help was finally here. The plainclothes officers made their way toward the table, moving carefully to avoid spooking anyone. Diana stepped back, her throat tight with anticipation. The boy must have sensed something too, because he sat up straighter, his eyes darting toward the approaching men. The woman was just standing up from gathering her things when one of the officers pulled out his badge. "Excuse me," he said quietly, positioning himself between the couple and the boy. "We need to have a word." The man's face went from angry to pale in an instant. The woman's purse slipped from her fingers again, but this time no one moved to pick it up. The boy remained perfectly still, but Diana saw his shoulders relax just slightly, like someone who'd been holding their breath for a very long time. From the corner of her eye, Diana saw uniformed officers entering through both the front and back doors of the restaurant. Other customers were starting to notice something was happening, heads turning toward the scene. Jenny appeared at her side, gripping her hand tightly in support as they watched the situation unfold. The boy's eyes met Diana's across the restaurant. This time, instead of fear, she saw something else in his gaze, the faintest glimmer of hope. Everything happened so quickly after that. The calm morning atmosphere of the restaurant transformed in seconds. The man's face turned from pale to red as he started to stand, but the plainclothes officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir, please remain seated." The woman's reaction was different. She tried to stay calm, putting on a confused smile. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We're just having breakfast with our son." "Right, sweetie?" She turned to the boy, but he kept his eyes down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Other customers had stopped eating, watching the scene unfold. The soft clink of forks against plates had been replaced by whispered conversations and the rustle of movement as uniformed officers positioned themselves around the restaurant. Diana stood near the counter, her heart racing as she watched. Jenny stayed close by her side, both of them unable to look away. The manager had come out from his office, speaking quietly with one of the officers near the kitchen. "Ma'am," the second plainclothes officer said to the woman, "we have reason to believe this child is not your son." His voice was calm but firm. "We need to verify some information." The boy was still sitting quietly, but Diana noticed his breathing had changed. It was like he was trying not to show how relieved he felt, afraid to believe this was really happening. A female officer in uniform had made her way to his side of the booth, positioning herself protectively near him. The man suddenly changed tactics, his angry expression morphing into something more calculated. "This is ridiculous," he said smoothly. "We have papers. We can prove he's ours." He reached slowly toward his jacket pocket, but another officer stepped forward, stopping him. Diana watched as more officers entered the restaurant. Through the windows, she could see police cars parked at all exits. The morning sun caught their badges, sending little flashes of light across the dining room walls. One of the officers was talking into his radio, and Diana caught fragments of the conversation. "Match the description. Amber Alert from Michigan. 2 months ago." Her hand flew to her mouth as she realized the full scope of what had been happening right in front of her. The woman must have heard too, because her calm facade cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "We're helping him. His parents," but she stopped when the officer raised his hand. "Ma'am, we already have confirmation. This child was reported missing from Detroit. His real parents have been searching for him for months. The officer's words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet restaurant. Diana watched as the female officer gently helped the boy slide out of the booth. For the first time since they'd arrived, he stood up straight, no longer trying to make himself smaller. When the officer put a gentle hand on his shoulder, he didn't flinch away like he had from the couple. The man and woman were being handcuffed now, the metallic click of the cuffs eerily loud in the hushed restaurant. The man had gone silent, but the woman had started crying. Not the tears of someone sorry for what they'd done, but the tears of someone sorry they got caught. "You did the right thing," Jenny whispered to Diana, squeezing her arm. "You saved him." Diana could barely speak, watching as the boy was led toward the front of the restaurant. He paused for a moment and looked back, his eyes finding hers. Then he did something that made her heart catch. He smiled. It was small and shaky, but it was real. It was the first true expression she'd seen on his face all morning. The female officer was talking to him softly now, leading him outside where a victim services worker was waiting. The couple was being led out a different door, separated from each other and the boy they had tried to keep captive. Other officers were now approaching Diana, notebooks ready. They would need her statement, need to know everything she had observed. But for now, she just stood there, watching through the window as the boy climbed into a car with the victim services worker. He was safe. Whatever happened next, he was finally safe. The next few hours passed in a blur. Diana sat in a quiet booth, different now from her usual spot serving customers, as police officers gently asked her questions. She told them everything. How the boy's silence had first caught her attention, the bruises she'd noticed, and most importantly, the hand signal that had confirmed her worst fears. That signal saved his life. One of the officers told her, looking up from his notepad. "We've been tracking this couple for weeks, but they kept moving from state to state. They were always one step ahead of us." He paused, shaking his head. "Until today." The restaurant had been closed to new customers, but a few regulars who'd been there during the incident stayed behind to give statements. Mrs. Chen, who'd been drinking her usual morning tea by the window, came over to squeeze Diana's hand before she left. "I saw everything," she said quietly. "You were so brave." Jenny brought her a cup of hot chocolate, something they usually reserved for kids having rough days. "You look like you could use this," she said, sliding into the booth across from Diana. The familiar sweetness was comforting, helping to settle her still shaking hands. The manager had been talking with the police near the entrance. Now he walked over, pulling up a chair. "The detective just told me more about the situation," he said, his usual businesslike manner softened with concern. "The boy. He was taken from Detroit 2 months ago. His parents have been searching for him ever since." Diana's eyes filled with tears. 2 months. That boy had been away from his real family for 2 months, being dragged from place to place by people who treated him like property instead of a child. She thought about all the other restaurants they must have visited, all the other people who might have noticed something wrong but didn't say anything. They were human traffickers, the detective explained, joining their small group. "Part of a larger network we've been investigating. The boy isn't their first victim, but thanks to you, he'll be their last." He showed them a tablet with news headlines already appearing about the arrest. "We found evidence in their car linking them to other missing children cases." Through the window, Diana could see the crime scene unit going through a dark SUV in the parking lot. The couple had been taken away in separate police cars earlier, their perfect facade crumbling as the handcuffs clicked into place. "The boy's parents are already on their way," the detective continued. "They should be here by evening. 2 months of searching, and they finally get to hold their son again." He looked at Diana with genuine respect. "Because you paid attention. Because you cared enough to get involved." Jenny reached across the table to grab Diana's hand. "I still can't believe you spotted all those little signs. I serve families every day and never noticed things like that." That's why we do these trainings, the manager said. The hand signal, the behavioral signs, they're subtle for a reason. Traffickers count on people being too busy or too afraid to speak up. Diana thought about how close she'd come to ignoring her instincts, to convincing herself it wasn't her business. The weight of what could have happened if she'd stayed silent pressed against her chest. "Will he be okay?" she asked quietly. "After everything he's been through." The detective's face softened. "Kids are remarkably resilient. He'll have support, counseling, victim services, and most importantly, his family. It won't be easy, but he's young enough to heal, to move forward." He paused, then added, "The victim services worker said he kept talking about the nice waitress who helped him. You gave him something very important today. You showed him that there are still good people in the world, people who will help when you ask." Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Soon, the restaurant would reopen. Customers would come in, life would go on. But Diana knew that nothing would ever feel quite the same. She'd always look a little closer now, pay a little more attention. Because sometimes the biggest differences in the world start with the smallest observations. Evening had fallen by the time the boy's real parents arrived. Diana had stayed at the restaurant long after her shift ended, unable to leave until she knew he was safely back with his family. She sat at the counter, absently stirring a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The detective had kept them updated throughout the day. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. In the couple's car, they found fake IDs, multiple cell phones, and, most disturbingly, notes about other potential targets. The boy wasn't just saved from his own nightmare. His rescue had helped uncover an entire trafficking operation. "They're here," Jenny called softly from near the window. Diana looked up to see a car pulling into the parking lot, followed by a police escort. Her heart started beating faster. The restaurant was empty now, except for essential staff and police. They had wanted to make this reunion as private as possible. Diana watched through the window as a couple practically flew from their car. A mother and father who had spent 2 months living every parent's worst nightmare. The boy had been waiting in a private office with a victim services worker. When the detective brought his parents to the door, Diana heard the mother's cry of relief echo through the quiet restaurant. "Baby." She rushed forward as her son ran into her arms. Diana felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched the family holding each other. The father had wrapped his arms around both his wife and son, and all three of them were crying. It was like they were afraid to let go, as if their son might disappear again if they loosened their grip even slightly. "I saw it on the news first," the father told the detective, his voice thick with emotion. "A trafficking ring busted at a Denny's restaurant. I hoped. We've had so many false hopes these past months. But then the police called." He couldn't finish, just pulled his son closer. The mother looked up, her eyes searching the room until they found Diana. "Are you the waitress?" she asked, her voice trembling. When Diana nodded, the woman gently disentangled herself from her family and walked over. "The police told us what you did," she said. "How you noticed the signs. How you'd kept them there until help arrived." Without warning, she pulled Diana into a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing my boy when so many others looked away." The boy was talking now, really talking, for the first time since he entered the restaurant that morning. His voice was quiet but growing stronger as he told his parents about the hand signal he'd learned about from social media. "I wasn't sure if anyone would know what it meant," he said. "But she saw me. She understood." The detective was explaining to the parents about the investigation, about how their son's rescue had helped uncover a larger criminal network. But Diana wasn't really listening anymore. She was watching the boy, seeing how different he looked now. His shoulders were relaxed, his eyes bright and alive. He looked like what he was, a child who finally felt safe again. Jenny appeared at her side with a fresh cup of coffee and a box of tissues. "You okay?" she asked softly. Diana nodded, wiping her eyes. You know what's crazy? She said. This morning I was so worried about being wrong, about causing trouble over nothing. Now I can't imagine what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet. The boy was showing his parents a drawing he'd made while waiting for them. A simple picture of a restaurant table and a stick figure with an apron. At the bottom, in careful letters, he'd written thank you. Outside, news vans were starting to gather. The story was spreading quickly. A trafficking ring brought down because a waitress paid attention, because a boy remembered a hand signal, because people chose to get involved instead of looking away. Tomorrow, there would be interviews and more questions. The story would be on every local channel, probably national news too. But right now, in this quiet moment, Diana just watched a family healing, holding each other close. Sometimes the biggest heroes aren't wearing capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're just people who choose to pay attention, who decide to trust their instincts, who refuse to look away when something feels wrong. A week had passed since that life-changing morning at Denny's. Diana sat on her living room couch, still amazed by how much had changed. The local newspaper lay on her coffee table, its headline reading "Local Waitress Helps Break Major Trafficking Ring." She hadn't read it yet. It felt strange seeing her own face looking back from the front page. Her phone buzzed with another message from Jenny. News stations were still calling the restaurant, hoping to get an interview. The story had spread far beyond their small town, touching hearts across the country. But Diana hadn't wanted to do any interviews. For her, the only thing that mattered was that a boy was back home with his family where he belonged. The investigation had revealed more than anyone expected. The couple had been part of a larger network operating across 5 states. Their arrest led police to 3 more trafficking operations, and within days, 5 more missing children were found and rescued. Diana's manager had given her the week off, but she was ready to go back tomorrow. Life had to go on. Still, she knew things would never be quite the same. The regular customers who'd been there that morning had spread the word. Now, every server in town had taken the trafficking awareness training. Local businesses had put up posters about the distress signal, making sure everyone knew what it meant. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a delivery person holding a large envelope. Inside was a letter from the boy's parents, along with a family photo taken just yesterday. The boy was smiling, a real bright smile that reached his eyes. He was holding up a drawing he'd made for his school project, titled "My Hero Doesn't Wear a Cape." The letter was simple but heartfelt. They wrote about how he was doing, back in school now, spending time with friends, sleeping in his own bed again. He was getting counseling, they said, and while there were still tough moments, he was healing a little more each day. They'd started a foundation to raise awareness about trafficking signals and signs, hoping to help other families avoid what they'd been through. Diana pinned the photo to her refrigerator, right next to the thank you card Jenny had given her. Her friend had written, "Never doubt that one person can change the world." It had seemed dramatic at the time, but now she understood. Her phone lit up with a news alert. Another child had been saved in a neighboring state. Someone had recognized the hand signal in a grocery store and called for help. The same signal that had started everything that morning in her restaurant was spreading, becoming common knowledge. People were paying attention now, really paying attention. Tomorrow, she would put on her apron and return to serving pancakes and coffee. She would chat with regulars and welcome new customers. But she would never again wonder if paying attention mattered. She would never again hesitate to trust her instincts. The evening news played quietly in the background as she made dinner. They were showing a segment about new trafficking awareness programs being implemented in schools and businesses across the country. The boy's story had sparked a movement, turning one quiet act of observation into a wave of change. Diana thought about all the little moments that had led to that morning. The training session she'd almost skipped, the social media posts that had taught a young boy a silent cry for help, the split-second decision to trust her gut. None of them seemed important on their own, but together they had changed lives. Her phone buzzed one more time. It was a message from the detective. Thought you'd want to know. Final tally came in. 8 children rescued, 3 trafficking rings shut down, 12 arrests made. All because you noticed something wrong and chose to act. Diana smiled, thinking about the boy's drawing of her in her waitress apron. Sometimes heroes don't look like what we expect. Sometimes they're just regular people who choose to pay attention, to care, to act. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like really seeing someone who needs help and being brave enough to reach out. She looked at the family photo again, at the boy's bright smile, and knew that every uncertain moment had been worth it. In the end, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human, about choosing to care, to notice, to help. And that was something anyone could do, any day, anywhere. All they had to do was pay attention and be brave enough to act.